Okay, we're going to continue reading from George Smith's book, and we're on chapter 2, Babylonian and Assyrian Literature. Babylonian Literature, Koyunjik Library, Fragmentary Condition, Arrangement of Tablets, Subject Dates, Babylonian Source of Literature, Literary Period, The War of the Gods, Dubar, the legends. Okay, we went over a lot of that stuff last time. Okay, let's just scroll down and get into the chapter here. In order to understand the position of these legends, it is necessary to give some account of the wonderful literature of the ancient Babylonians and their copyists, the Assyrians. The fragments of terracotta tablets containing these legends were found in the debris which covers the palaces called the Southwest Palace and the North Palace of Koyunjik, the former building being of the age of Sennacherib, the latter belonging to the time of Assurbanipal. The tablets, which are of all sizes, from 1 inch long to over a foot, or to over a square foot, are nearly all in fragments, and in consequence of the changes which have taken place in the ruins, the fragments of the same tablet are sometimes scattered widely apart. It appears from a consideration of the present positions of the fragments that they were originally in the upper chambers of the palace and have fallen on to the destruction of the buildings. In some of the lower chambers, they lay covering the whole floor. In other cases, they lay in groups or patches on the pavement. And there are occasional clusters of fragments at various heights in the earth, which covers the buildings. The other fragments are scattered singly through all the upper earth, which covers the floors and walls of the place. Different fragments of some tablets and cylinders are found in separate chambers, which have no immediate connection with each other, showing that the present distribution of the fragments has nothing to do with the original position of the tablets. A consideration of the inscriptions shows that these tablets have been arranged according to their subjects in various positions in the libraries. Stories or subjects were commenced on tablets and continued on other tablets of the same size and form. In some cases, the number of tablets in a series and on a single subject amounting to over 100. Each subject or series of tablets had a title, the title being formed by the first phrase or part of the phrase in the subject. Thus, the series of astrological tablets numbering over 70 tablets bore the title, When the Gods, Anu, Elu, this being the commencement of the first tablet. At the end of every tablet in each series was written its number in the work. Thus, the first tablet, When the Gods, Anu, Elu, and the second tablet of When the Gods, Anu, Elu, and further, to preserve the proper position of each tablet, everyone except the last in a series had at the end a catchphrase consisting of the first line in the following tablet. There were besides catalogs of these documents written like them on clay tablets and other small oval tablets with titles upon them, apparently labels for the various series of works. All of these arrangements show the care taken with respect to literary matters. There were regular libraries or chambers, probably on the upper floors of the palaces, appointed for the store of the tablets, and custodians or librarians to take charge of them. This is probable that all these regulations were of great antiquity and were copied like the tablets from the Babylonians. Judging from the fragments discovered, it appears probable that there were in the royal library at Nineveh over 10,000 inscribed tablets, including almost every subject in ancient literature. In considering a subject like the present one, it is a point of the utmost importance to define as closely as possible the date of our present copies of the legends and the most probable period at which the original copies may have been inscribed. By far the greatest number of the tablets brought from Nineveh belong to the age of Assurbanipal, who reigned over Assyria BC 670, and every copy of Genesis legends yet found was inscribed during his reign. The statement on the present tablets are conclusive on this point, and have not been called into question, but it is equally stated and acknowledged on all hands that these tablets are not the originals, but are only copies from earlier texts. It is unfortunate that the date of the original copies is never preserved, and thus a wide door is thrown open for difference of opinions on this point. The Assyrians acknowledge themselves that this literature was borrowed from the Babylonian sources, and of course it is Babylonia. We have to look to ascertain the approximate dates of the original documents. The difficulty here is increased by the following considerations. It appears that in an early period in Babylonian history a great literary development took place, and numerous works were produced which embodied the prevailing myths, religion, and science of that day. Many of them in a noble style of poetry and appealing to the strongest feelings of the people on one side, or registering the highest efforts of their science on the other. These texts became the standards for Babylonian literature, and later generations were content to copy these writings instead of making new works for themselves. Clay, the material on which they were written, was everywhere abundant. Copies were multiplied, and by the veneration in which they were held, these texts fixed and stereotyped the style of Babylonian literature, and the language in which they were written remained the classical style in the country down to the Persian conquest. Thus it happens that texts of Rim Agu, Sargon, and Hammurabi who were 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus. They show the same language as the texts of the later kings, there being no sensible difference in style to match the long interval between them. There is, however, to believe that although the language of devotion and literature remained fixed, the speech of the bulk of the people was gradually modified, and in the time of Assurbanipal, when the Assyrians copied the Genesis legends, the common speech of the day was in very different style. The private letters and dispatches of the age which have been discovered differ widely from the language of the contemporary public documents and religious writings, showing the change in language had undergone since the style of these was fixed. We have a slightly similar case in England, where the language of devotion and the style of the Bible differ in several respects from those of the English of today. These considerations show the difficulty in fixing the age of the document from its style, and the difficulty is further increased by the uncertainty which hangs over all Babylonian chronology. Chronology is always a thorny subject, and dry and unsatisfactory to most persons. Besides, some notice must, however, be taken of it here in order to show the reason for the dates and the epochs fixed upon for the Genesis legends. In this case, the later chronology is not in question, and it is best to start with a generally received date of about BC 1300 for the conquest of Babylonia by Tugal-Tininip, king of Assyria. Before this date, we have a period of about 250 years during which a foreign race ruled at Babylon. Berosus called these foreigners Arabs, but nothing is known to their original home or race. It is supposed that this race came into Babylon or obtained dominion there under a king named Hammurabi, whose date is thus fixed about BC 1550. Many scholars do not agree to this and consider Hammurabi much more ancient. No one, however, fixes him later than the 16th century BC, so that the date BC 1550 may be accepted as the most moderate and possible for the epoch of Hammurabi. The date of Hammurabi is of consequence in the question, because there is no evidence of these languages being written after his epoch. The circumstance may be accounted for by the fact that during the period following the conquest of Hammurabi, the government was in the hands of foreigners and was much more centralized than it had been before, Babylon being, so far as we know, the sole capital, the great cities, which had been centers of literature, suffering a decline. Before the time of Hammurabi, there ruled several races of kings, of whom we possess numerous monuments. These monarchs principally reigned at the city of Ur, Karak, Larsa, and Akkad. Their inscriptions do not determine the length of their rule, but they probably covered the period from BC 2000 to 1550. The name of the monarch in whose time we have the first satisfactory evidence of contemporary moments is read Uruk, and in the present state of our researches, he may be fixed BC 2000. It must, however, be remarked that many scholars place him at a much earlier date. From the time of Uruk to that of Hammurabi, the title of honor principally taken by the kings is King of Sumer and Akkad, that is, King of Lower and Upper Babylonia. It appears probable that previous to the reign of Uruk, the two divisions of Sumer and Akkad were separate monarchies, and it is therefore likely that any literature written before BC 2000 will show evidences of this division. The rough outlines of Babylonian chronology at this period may be arranged as follows, always bearing in mind that the different dates are the lowest we can fairly assume, and the several of them may be much more ancient. Down to BC 2000, down to BC 2000, epoch of independent kingdoms in Babylon, the principal center of activity being Akkad, a region on the Euphrates, somewhere between latitude 32 and 33. BC 2000, era of Uruk, king of Ur, rise of Sumer, the southern part of the country, Ur the metropolis. BC 1850, era of Isma Dagon, king of Karak the metropolis. BC 1700, the rise of Larsa as the metropolis, and then BC 1600, the era of Sargon, king of Akkad, revival of the power of Akkad. BC 1550, era of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, the metropolis. Although we cannot fix the dates of any monuments before the time of Uruk BC 2000, it is quite certain that there were buildings and inscriptions before that date. And there are two literary works which I should judge to be certainly older than this epoch, namely the great Chaldean work on astrology and the legend which, for want of a better title, I call the exploits of Lubara. The Chaldean work containing the bulk of their astrology appears to be to the north half of the country, that is, to Akkad, and always speaks of Akkad as a separate state and implies to be the leading state. It mentions beside the kingdom of Sabartu, Martu or Syria, Gutim or Goyim, and Elam. And some parts, perhaps the later date that then the body of the work gives also the kingdom of Kasi, Kisadi, or the peoples, Nituk or Asman, Sumir, Yamubal, and Asan. In the body of the work, there appear glosses, apparently later additions mentioning kings of the period BC 2000 to 1850. I have not noticed any gloss containing a royal name later than the king of Ur. The work that I have provisionally called The Exploits of Lubara, and which also bears evidence of great antiquity, is a much shorter one, for while there are over 70 large tablets of the astrology, that this, on the other hand, only contained 5 small tablets. This work notices a large number of peoples or states, the principal being the people of the coast, Sabartu, Assyria, Elam, Kasi, Sutu, Goyim, Lulubu, Akkad, and the uniting of Sumar and Akkad, which was accomplished at least BC 2000, is not mentioned, but the notice of the Assyrians is rather an argument for the later date than I have chosen. The Izdubar legends, containing the story of the flood and what I believe to be the history of Nimrod, who were probably written in the south of the country and at least as early as BC 2000. These legends were, however, traditions before they were committed to writings and were common in some form to all the country. The story of the creation and fall belongs to the upper or Akkad division of the country, and may not have been committed to writing so early as Izdubar legends, but even this is of great antiquity. About the same time as the account of the creation, a series of tablets on evil spirits, which contained a totally different tradition of the creation, was probably written, and there is a third account from the city of Kutha, closely agreeing with some respects, or in some respects, with the account handed down by Berosus, which I should provisionally place about the same date. It seems the indications in the inscriptions that there happened in the interval BC 2000 to 1850, a general collecting and development of the various traditions of the creation, flood, Tower of Babel, and other similar legends. A little later, about BC 1600, a new set of astrological tablets was written together with a long work on terrestrial omens. These appear to be the kingdom and period of Sargon, king of Assad. Some, at least, and probably most of the syllabaries, bilingual and explanatory tablets, grammars, and vocabularies belonging to this period also, but a few are of later date. In spite of the indications as to peculiarities of worship, names of states and capitals, historical allusions, and other evidence, it may seem hazardous to many persons to fix the dates of original documents so high, when our only copies, in many cases, are Assyrian transcripts made in the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC, but one or two considerations may show that this is a perfectly reasonable view, and no other likely period can be found for the original composition of the documents unless we ascend to a greater antiquity. In the first place, it must be noticed that the Assyrians themselves state that the documents were copied from ancient Babylonian copies, and in some cases state that the old copies were partly illegible even in their day. Again, In one case, there's actual proof of the antiquity of the text, an Assyrian copy of part of which is published in cuneiform inscriptions, Volume 2, Plate 54. In a collection of tablets discovered by Mr. Loftus and Sankara belonging, according to the king's mention in it, to about BC 1600, it is part of an ancient Babylonian copy of this very text, the Babylonian copy being about 1,000 years older than the Assyrian ones. It is, however, probable that most of the legends treated of in the present volume had existed as traditions in the country long before they were committed to writing, and some of these traditions, as embodied in the various works, exhibit great differences in detail, showing that they had passed through many changes. Taking the period of literary development in Babylonia as extending from BC 2000 to 1550, we may say it roughly synchronizes with the period from Abraham to Moses, according to the ordinary chronology of our Bibles, and during this period it appears that traditions of the creation of the universe and human history down to the time of Nimrod existed parallel to, and in some points identical with, those given in the book of Genesis. Many of the documents embodying these traditions have been discovered in sadly mutilated condition, but there can be no doubt that future explorations will rival more perfect copies, and numerous companion and explanatory texts which will one day clear up the difficulties which now meet us every step of their consideration. So far as known contemporary inscriptions are concerned, we cannot consider our present researches and discoveries as anything like sufficient to give a fair view of the literature of Assyria and Babylonia, and however numerous and important are the Genesis legends, they form but a small portion of the whole literature of the country. It is generally considered that the earliest inscriptions of any importance which we now possess belong to the time of Uruk, king of Ur, whose age may be placed with great probability about 2,000 years before the Christian era. The principal inscriptions of this period consist of texts on bricks and on signet seals, and of some latter may be of much greater antiquity. Passing down to the period of the kingdoms of Kerak, Larsa, and Akkad, we find a great accession of literary material, almost every class of writing being represented by contemporary specimens. It is certain that even then the inscribed clay tablets were not isolated, but already they were arranged in collections or libraries, and these collections were placed at some of the principal cities. From Senkirch and its neighborhood have come our earliest specimens of these literary tablets, following being some of contents of the earliest known library. Mythological tablets including lists of the gods and their manifestations and titles, grammatical works, lists of words and explanations, mathematical works, calculations, tables, cube and square foot measures, astronomy, astrology, and omens, legends and short historical inscriptions, historical cylinders, one of Kudur Marduk, BC 1600, the earliest known cylinder, being in the British Museum, geographical tablets and lists of towns and countries, laws and law cases, sale and barter, wills and loans. Such are inscriptions from the libraries of the early inhabitants of Babylonia. And besides these, there are numerous texts only known to us through later copies, but which certainly had their origin as early as this period. So did you guys catch that? This is talking about they had like legal documents, laws, wills, trusts. So if you're wondering like where our legal system came from, where you have laws written down and receipts and wills, trusts, legal documents, all this stuff started back in Babylonia. Babylon, the Anunnaki. This is where we get the whole system that we have in place today that is still being used today. It all comes from these Anunnaki beings. Passing down from this period, for some centuries, we find only detached inscriptions accompanied by evidence of the gradual shifting both of the political power and literary activity from Babylonia to Assyria. In Assyria, the first center of literature and seat of a library was the city of Assur. And in parentheses, it says Kile or Kile Shirgat. And the earliest known tablets date BC 1500. Beyond the scanty record of some of the monarchs, nothing of value remains of this library for several centuries, and the Assyrian literary works are only known from later copies. A revival of the Assyrian Empire made under Assur-Nasir-Pal, king of Assyria, who ascended the throne BC 885, he rebuilt the city of Kala, and in parentheses it says Nimrod, and this city became the seat of an Assyrian library. Tablets were procured from Babylonia by Shalmaneser, son of Assur-Nisr-Pal, or Paul, I'm not sure how you pronounce the last part of his name. That was BC 1860 during the reign of Nabu-Bal-Idina, king of Babylon, and these were copied by the Assyrian scribes and placed in the royal libraries. Vol-Nirari, grandson of Shalmaneser, BC 1812, added to the Kala library and had tablets written at Nineveh. Assur-Nirari, BC 755, continued the literary work, some mythological tablets being dated in his region. Tiglath-Pileser, BC 745, enlarged the library and placed it in various copies of historical inscriptions. It was, however, reserved for Sargon, who founded the last Assyrian dynasty, BC 722, to make the Assyrian royal library worthy of the empire. Early in his reign, he appointed Nabu-Sukubjina principal librarian, and his officers set to work making new copies of all the standard works of the day. During the whole of his term, the office copies of the great literary works were produced, the majority of the text preserved belonging to the early period previous to BC 1600. In the period which followed, there was a general revival of the ancient works which had escaped destruction, and the study of this early literature became a marked feature of the time. Sennacherib, son of Sargon, BC 705, continued to add to his father's library at Kala, but late in his reign he removed the collection from the city to Nineveh, where from this time the National Library remained until the fall of the empire. Esarhaddon, son of Sennacherib, BC 681, further increased the national collection, most of his works being of a religious character. Assurbanipal, son of Esarhaddon, the Sardanapalus of the Greeks, BC 673, was the greatest of the Assyrian sovereigns, and he is far more memorable on account of his magnificent patronage of learning than on the account the greatness of the empire or the extent of his wars. Assurbanipal added more to the Assyrian royal library than all the kings who had gone before him, and this is to tablets written in his reign that we owe almost all our knowledge of the Babylonian myths and early history, beside many of the important matters. The agents of Assurbanipal sought everywhere for inscribed tablets, brought them to Nineveh, and copied them there. Thus, the literary treasures of Babylonia, Borsippa, Cutha, Akkad, Ur, Eruk, Larsa, Nippur, and the various cities were transferred to the Assyrian capital to enrich the great collection there. The fragments brought over to Europe give us a good idea of this library and show the range of the subjects embraced by this collection of inscriptions. Among the different classes of text, the Genesis stories and similar legends occupied a prominent place. These, as they will be further described in the present volume, need only to be mentioned here. Accompanying them, we have a series of mythological tablets of various sorts, varying from legends of the gods, psalms, songs, prayers, and hymns, down to mere allusions and lists of names. Many of these texts take the form of charms to be used in sickness and for the expulsion of evil spirits. Some of them are of great antiquity, being at least as old as the creation of Izdubar legends. One fine series concerns the cure of witchcraft, a superstition fully believed in those days. Izdubar is mentioned in one of these tablets as Lord of the oaths or pledges of the world. Some of the prayers were for use on special occasions, such as on starting a campaign, on the occurrence of an eclipse. Astronomy and astrology were represented by various detached inscriptions and reports, but principally by the great work on these subjects covering over 70 tablets, which was borrowed from the early Chaldeans, and many copies of which were in the library of Ashurbanipal. This work on astrology and astronomy was, as I have already stated, one of the most ancient texts in the Euphrates Valley. There were also numerous copies of a long work on terrestrial omens, which appears to date from the time of Sargon, king of Akkad, about BC 1600. In this work, everything in nature is supposed to portend to some coming event. This is a fragment of one astrological tablet which professes to be copied from an original time of Izdubar. Historical texts form another section in the library, and these included numerous copies of inscriptions of the early Babylonian kings, besides chronological tablets with lists of kings and annual officers, inscriptions of various Assyrian monarchs, histories of the relations between Assyria and Babylonia, Elam and Arabia, treaties, dispatches, proclamations, and reports of the state of the empire and the military affairs. Natural history was represented by the tablets of animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, fishes, insects, and plants, trees, grasses, reeds, and grains, earth stones, etc. These lists are classified according to the supposed nature of the affinities of the various species and show considerable advance in the sciences. Mathematics had a place in the library. I lost my spot. A considerable advance in science. Mathematics had a place in the library, there being problems, figures, and calculations, but this branch of learning was not studied so fully as in Babylonia. Grammar and lexicography were better represented, there being many works on the subjects, including lists of the signs and explanations, declensions of nouns, conjunction or conjugation of verbs, examples of syntax, bilingual tablets, explanatory lists, etc. All these tablets were copied from the Babylonians. In law and civil matters, the library was also rich. The tablets served to show that some laws and customs prevailed in Assyria as in Babylonia. There are codes of laws, law cases, sale, barter, loans, lists of properties, lists of titles and trades, tribute, and taxes, etc. In geography, the Assyrians were not very forward, but there are lists of countries and their productions of cities, rivers, mountains, and peoples. Such are some of the principal contents of the great library from which we have obtained our copies of the creation and flood legends. Most of the tablets were copied from early Babylonian inscriptions. The original copies of the works have in most cases disappeared. But those remarkable inscriptions have preserved to us texts which show the wonderful advance made by the people of Chaldea before the time of Moses. Babylonian literature, which had been a part or been the parent of Assyrian writing, revived. The fall of Nineveh and Nebuchadnezzar and his successors made Babylon the seat of the library rivaling, and the Assurbanipal at Nineveh. Of this later development of Babylonian literature we know very little, explorations being still required to bring the light to the texts of this epoch. Few fragments only discovered by wandering Arabs or recovered by chance travelers have yet turned up, but there is in them evidence enough to promise a rich reward to future excavators. Okay, that was the end of chapter 2. So, do you see now why the United States government does things like blow up the World Trade Centers and blame it on some country in the Middle East so that they can gain support from the tax slaves to invade? They're after this kind of stuff. They're after these tablets. They're after this data and this knowledge. And they want the technology of these gods. They want the truth. They're after it. They don't want this getting out. They want it so bad they're willing to kill thousands and thousands of innocent people in our country and in these Middle Eastern countries just to get their hands on it. Is this all making sense now? I hope this is all making sense for everyone. All right, we're going to continue the next chapter in a separate upload. What do you guys think so far? Are you guys liking this book? The Chaldean or the Chaldean account of Genesis by George Smith. Let me know in the comments.